The aroma of garlic and rosemary should have been comforting as I stepped through the mahogany doors of Bella Vista, the upscale Italian restaurant where my parents had celebrated every major milestone for the past 15 years. Instead, my stomach churned as I heard my mother's voice carrying across the dimly lit dining room, her words slicing through the ambient chatter like a blade through silk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She's always been such a disappointment, Patricia Hartwell was saying to her dinner companion, completely unaware that her daughter stood frozen behind the hostess station. 28 years old and still chasing these ridiculous business fantasies. David and I have given up hope that she'll ever make something of herself. I pressed myself against the burgundy velvet curtain that separated the entrance from the main dining area, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the gap, I could see my parents sitting at their usual corner table, the one with the perfect view of the city skyline that the maître always reserved for them. My father, David Hartwell, was nodding along while cutting his osso buco with surgical precision, the same methodical approach he brought to everything in his life as Millbrook's most prominent cardiac surgeon. The tech startup was bad enough, my mother continued, gesturing dismissively with her wine glass. Throwing away her business degree to play around with computers like some teenager. But now she thinks she can flip houses? She doesn't understand that success requires breeding, connections, and frankly, a level of sophistication she simply lacks. The woman across from my parents was Margaret Chen, the wife of Millbrook General Hospital's chief administrator. I recognized her from countless charity galas and social events where my parents had paraded me around like a prized poodle, only to spend the car ride home dissecting every way I'd embarrassed them. Margaret's expression was a carefully neutral mask of polite interest, but I could see the discomfort in her eyes as my mother's voice grew louder with each sip of her Barolo. "We've tried everything," my father added, his deep voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used when delivering bad news to patients' families. "Private schools, tutors, connections at the country club. Nothing seems to stick. She's simply not capable of the kind of success that runs in our family." My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The tech startup they were so casually dismissing had actually been a modest success, generating enough profit for me to put a down payment on my first investment property 6 months ago. The house-flipping venture they mocked had already netted me a 15% return on my initial investment, and I had 3 more properties under contract. But none of that mattered to David and Patricia Hartwell, because success to them wasn't measured in profit margins or personal growth. It was measured in social standing, prestigious job titles, and the ability to name-drop at dinner parties. "The worst part," my mother was saying, dabbing at her lips with the cloth napkin, "is that she actually believes she's going to prove us wrong. She has this delusional confidence that's frankly embarrassing. Last week, she had the audacity to suggest we invest in one of her projects. Can you imagine?" Margaret Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Patricia, perhaps she's just trying to find her own path. Not everyone is cut out for traditional careers." My mother's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, Margaret, you're far too kind. Some people are simply born to be followers, not leaders. Elena has always been, well, let's call it unremarkable. Average grades, average looks, average ambition. We love her, of course, but we've had to accept that she'll never amount to anything significant." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life, but never delivered with such casual cruelty to someone outside our family. The fact that they were discussing my supposed failures at Bella Vista in front of Margaret Chen while enjoying their weekly tradition of fine dining and wine made the betrayal feel even more profound. I thought about the countless times I'd sat at that same corner table, listening to my parents hold court about their latest medical conferences, charity board appointments, and social conquests. How many times had they smiled at me across that white tablecloth, while secretly believing I was nothing more than a disappointment they had to endure? How many dinner conversations had I misread as family bonding when they were actually exercises in tolerance? My name is Elena Rodriguez Hartwell. And at 28, I'd spent most of my life trying to earn the respect of two people who had apparently decided I was worthless before I'd even graduated college. The hyphenated last name was my mother's concession to modern feminism, though she'd made it clear that keeping her maiden name was more about preserving the Rodriguez family's social connections than any commitment to equality. My father had built his reputation as one of the region's most skilled cardiac surgeons, while my mother had crafted her identity around being the perfect doctor's wife, complete with charity work, garden club leadership, and an encyclopedic knowledge of social etiquette. What they didn't know was that their disappointing daughter had been quietly building something they couldn't understand or control. My undergraduate degree in business administration from State University, which they considered beneath the Ivy League education they'd wanted for me, had actually provided me with practical skills they'd never bothered to learn. While they were busy maintaining their image, I was studying market trends, analyzing property values, and building a network of contractors, real estate agents, and investors who valued results over pedigree. The tech startup had been my first real venture into entrepreneurship. Nothing revolutionary, just a simple app that helped small businesses manage their inventory more efficiently. It wasn't going to change the world, but it had proven that I could identify a market need, develop a solution, and execute a business plan well enough to turn a profit. The fact that I'd sold it after 18 months for enough money to start my real estate investment company should have been cause for celebration. Instead, my parents had treated it like a lucky accident, something that happened to me rather than something I'd accomplished through hard work and strategic thinking. Elena has always been a dreamer, my father was explaining to Margaret, his tone suggesting that dreaming was a character flaw rather than a virtue. We tried to guide her towards something stable, something with a future. Medicine, law, even teaching would have been respectable. But she seems determined to chase these get-rich-quick schemes. Get-rich-quick schemes. That's what they called the months I'd spent researching market conditions, analyzing comparable sales, and learning everything I could about construction, permitting, and property management. That's what they called the 16-hour days I'd worked to transform a rundown Victorian house into a stunning family home that sold for $40,000 more than I'd invested. That's what they called the careful budgeting, strategic planning, and calculated risks that had allowed me to build a small but growing real estate portfolio. Some people are just meant to work for others, my mother added with a sigh that suggested profound disappointment. There's nothing wrong with being ordinary, of course. The world needs followers. But it's difficult when you've raised your child to have higher expectations and they simply can't meet them. I wanted to storm into that dining room and confront them with the truth about my growing success. I wanted to show them my bank statements, my investment portfolio, and the business plan I developed for expanding into commercial real estate. I wanted to force them to.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Acknowledge that their ordinary, unremarkable daughter was actually building something extraordinary without their help or approval. But as I stood there listening to them dissect my character like they were performing surgery, I realized that confrontation wouldn't change anything. They'd dismiss my current success the same way they'd dismissed everything else, finding reasons why it didn't count or wouldn't last. They'd probably suggest I'd gotten lucky, or that the market conditions were temporarily favorable, or that real success required something I'd never possess. Instead, a different kind of plan began forming in my mind, something that would prove my worth in a language they couldn't ignore or dismiss. Something that would demonstrate exactly how much their disappointing daughter had learned about business, about success, and about the kind of power that money could buy. I looked around Bella Vista's elegant interior, taking note of every detail I'd previously overlooked. The imported marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the carefully curated wine collection displayed behind glass. The restaurant had been a Millbrook institution for over 2 decades, the kind of place where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. My parents had been coming here since before I was born, and in all those years I'd never really paid attention to it as a business. I'd just seen it as the backdrop for countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings. But now, as I listened to them casually destroy my reputation over their weekly osso, buco, and barolo, I began to see Bella Vista differently. I saw it as an opportunity. A chance to demonstrate exactly what their unremarkable daughter was capable of accomplishing when she set her mind to something. The hostess approached me with a concerned expression. "Miss, are you waiting for a table? We have a lovely spot available by the window." "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I was wondering if you could tell me who owns this place." She looked surprised by the question. "Oh, that would be the Castellano family. They've owned Bella Vista for over 20 years. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I replied, pulling out my phone to make a note. "It's such a beautiful establishment. They must be very proud of what they've built here." As I walked back to my car, my parents' words echoing in my head, I was already mentally composing the research plan that would consume the next several months of my life. If David and Patricia Hartwell wanted to judge their daughter's worth based on her ability to succeed in business, then I would give them a demonstration they'd never forget. They thought I'd never amount to anything? I was about to show them exactly what their disappointing daughter could accomplish when she decided to stop seeking their approval and start seeking their respect. And if I couldn't earn their respect, well, there were other ways to make an impact on people who had spent 28 years underestimating what I was capable of achieving. The next morning, I sat in my home office surrounded by spreadsheets, market analyses, and property records that would have made my business school professors proud. My converted spare bedroom had become the nerve center of Rodriguez Hartwell Investments, though I was seriously considering dropping the Hartwell part of the name after last night's revelation. The walls were covered with charts tracking my current properties, potential acquisitions, and market trends that guided my investment decisions. I'd spent the weekend diving deep into everything I could find about Bella Vista, and what I discovered was fascinating. The Castellano family had indeed owned the restaurant for 23 years, building it from a small neighborhood bistro into one of Millbrook's premier dining destinations. But like many family-owned businesses, they were facing challenges that weren't immediately obvious to their customers. Giuseppe Castellano, the founder, had passed away 2 years ago, leaving the business to his 3 children, who had very different ideas about its future. The eldest son wanted to expand into catering and event planning. The daughter preferred to maintain the intimate, traditional atmosphere that had made Bella Vista special. The youngest son was pushing for modernization, including online ordering and delivery services that would increase revenue but potentially change the restaurant's character. According to the business records I'd obtained through my network of contacts, Bella Vista was profitable but not thriving. The prime downtown location came with astronomical rent, food costs were rising, and competition from newer establishments was eating into their market share. They were doing well enough to stay afloat, but not well enough to fund the expansion or renovations that would secure their long-term success. More importantly, I'd learned through a conversation with my real estate agent that the building housing Bella Vista was actually owned by a separate entity, Millbrook Properties LLC, which had been quietly acquiring downtown real estate for the past 5 years. The Castellanos were locked into a lease that would expire in 18 months, with rent increases that would significantly impact their already tight profit margins. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd learned to recognize during my brief but successful venture into business consulting. An established business with strong fundamentals but limited capital, facing external pressures that threatened their stability. The kind of situation where the right investor could provide both financial resources and strategic guidance to ensure long-term success. But as I studied the numbers and considered my options, I realized this wasn't just about making a smart investment. This was about sending a message to 2 people who had spent my entire life convincing me that I wasn't capable of significant success. This was about proving that their disappointing daughter could not only succeed in business but could actually control something they valued and depended upon. The idea that had been forming since last night was audacious, probably impractical, and definitely driven by emotions rather than pure business logic. But the more I thought about it, the more feasible it seemed. I had the capital, thanks to my recent property sales. I had the business knowledge, thanks to my education and experience. And most importantly, I had the motivation that only comes from being systematically underestimated by the people whose opinion should matter most. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Dinner Sunday at 7. Dad has news about the hospital expansion project." Don't be late. I stared at the message, remembering countless similar summons over the years. Family dinners where I was expected to play the role of the dutiful daughter, listening politely while my parents discussed their important work and social obligations. Dinners where my own projects and accomplishments were treated as amusing hobbies rather than serious business ventures. This time would be different, though they wouldn't know it yet. This time I'd be sitting at their table while quietly executing a plan that would demonstrate exactly what their unremarkable daughter was capable of achieving. They wanted to judge my worth based on my ability to succeed in the business world? Perfect. I was about to give them a masterclass in strategic thinking, market analysis, and the kind of decisive action that separated successful entrepreneurs from people who just talked about success. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. Acquisition strategy, Bella Vista Restaurant. It was time to show David and Patricia Hartwell what their daughter had learned about business, about success, and about the kind of power that came from being consistently underestimated by people who should have known better. The foundation they'd built their judgment on was about to shift in ways they couldn't imagine, and this time I wouldn't be seeking their approval. I'd be demonstrating why they should have been seeking mine. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into researching the restaurant industry with the same intensity I'd brought to every successful project in my career. I studied profit margins, operational costs, staffing patterns, and customer demographics. I analyzed Bella Vista's competition, their marketing strategies, and their customer reviews across multiple platforms. I even spent several evenings sitting at the bar, observing their operations firsthand while nursing a glass of wine and taking discreet notes about everything from table turnover rates to inventory management. What I discovered confirmed my initial assessment. Bella Vista was a well-run establishment with a loyal customer base, but they were operating with razor-thin margins and limited growth opportunities. The Castellano siblings' disagreement about the restaurant's future direction was creating operational inefficiencies and preventing them from making necessary investments in equipment, marketing, and staff development. More importantly, I'd confirmed that Millbrook Properties LLC was indeed pressuring them with lease renewal terms that would make their current business model unsustainable. The property management company was betting that Bella Vista's emotional attachment to their longtime location would force them to accept unfavorable terms rather than relocate and rebuild their customer base elsewhere. It was a classic case of financial leverage being used to exploit small business owners who had more expertise than capital. The kind of situation that my business education had taught me to recognize and, more importantly, to solve through strategic intervention and adequate funding. But I also discovered something else during those evening reconnaissance missions. My parents weren't just regular customers at Bella Vista. They were practically part of the furniture. The staff knew their preferences, their usual orders, and their preferred seating arrangements. Other diners nodded respectfully when David and Patricia entered, acknowledging their status as pillars of the local medical and social community. The maître d' treated them like visiting royalty, ensuring they never waited for a table and always received impeccable service. Bella Vista wasn't just a restaurant to my parents. It was a stage where they performed their roles as successful, sophisticated members of Millbrook's elite. It was where they celebrated David's promotions, Patricia's charity fundraising successes, and major family milestones. It was where they brought out-of-town guests to demonstrate their refined taste and social connections. It was, in many ways, an extension of their carefully crafted public image, which made my emerging plan even more perfect. I scheduled a meeting with Giuseppe Castellano Jr., the eldest son who was currently managing the restaurant's day-to-day operations. We met on a Tuesday afternoon when the dining room was closed, and I could see the stress lines around his eyes as he walked me through Bella Vista's financial situation, with the weary resignation of someone who'd been fighting an uphill battle for too long. "We're not failing," he explained, pouring us both espresso from the machine behind the bar. "But we're not growing either. Every month is a struggle to maintain what we have, and there's no room for the investments we need to stay competitive." I reviewed the financial documents he'd prepared, noting the steady decline in profit margins over the past 3 years, despite consistent revenue. "What about the lease situation?" Giuseppe's expression darkened. Millbrook Properties wants to increase our rent by 40% when the lease expires. They know we can't afford to relocate, so they're essentially holding us hostage. We've built our reputation here over 2 decades, and starting over somewhere else would mean losing most of our customer base. Have you considered selling? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his espresso cup. My father would turn over in his grave, but yes, we've discussed it. The problem is finding a buyer who understands the restaurant business and wants to maintain what we've built here. Most investors would either gut the full place and turn it into something completely different, or they'd change the menu and atmosphere to cut costs. I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. What if I told you there was a third option? Someone who could provide the capital you need to secure a favorable lease renewal and fund the improvements that would position Bella Vista for long-term growth, while respecting the tradition and quality that made this place special. Giuseppe looked up sharply. Are you talking about a partnership? I'm talking about a full acquisition, but with a commitment to maintaining the restaurant's character and keeping the current management team in place. You and your siblings would remain involved in operations, but as well-compensated employees rather than owners carrying all the financial risk. For the next hour, I outlined my preliminary proposal. I would purchase Bella Vista for a price that would allow the Castellano family to pay off their debts and walk away with a substantial profit. I would negotiate a new long-term lease with Millbrook Properties, using my real estate connections and financial resources to secure terms that would ensure the restaurant's stability. And I would invest in the equipment upgrades, marketing initiatives, and staff development programs that would position Bella Vista for sustainable growth. Giuseppe listened with growing interest, asking detailed questions about my background, my financing, and my long-term vision for the restaurant. By the end of our conversation, he was leaning back in his chair with the first relaxed expression I'd seen from him. I have to discuss this with my brother and sister, he said finally. But Elena, I have to ask, why Bella Vista? You could invest in any number of restaurants, or start your own place. What makes this opportunity special to you? I smiled, thinking about my parents' weekly dinner routine and their casual destruction of my reputation over osso buco and wine. Let's just say I have a personal connection to this place. I want to see it succeed, and I believe I have the resources and expertise to make that happen. What I didn't tell Giuseppe was that I'd already begun preliminary negotiations with Millbrook Properties LLC through my real estate attorney. The property management company was far more interested in dealing with a well-capitalized investor than they were in squeezing rent increases out of a struggling family business. Within a week, I had a tentative agreement for a 15-year lease at terms that would actually reduce Bella Vista's monthly rent while providing built-in escalations tied to revenue rather than arbitrary market rates. I also didn't mention that I'd already identified 3 other downtown properties that would be perfect for restaurant expansion, should the Bella Vista acquisition prove successful enough to warrant growing the concept. My parents thought I was chasing get-rich-quick schemes, but what I was actually building was a carefully planned entry into the hospitality industry, with Bella Vista serving as both my flagship property and my personal statement about the kind of success that real business acumen could achieve. The following Sunday dinner at my parents' house proceeded exactly as I'd expected. My father dominated the conversation with updates about the hospital's expansion project, a $40 million renovation that would add a new cardiac surgery wing and cement his reputation as one of the region's most influential physicians. My mother chimed in with details about the charity auction she was organizing to support the project, name-dropping the various local celebrities and business leaders who had committed to attending. Elena, you've been quiet tonight, my mother observed, as she served the tiramisu she'd ordered specially from Bella Vista for dessert. How are your little house projects going? Little house projects. I took a careful sip of wine and smiled politely. Actually, I've been exploring some new opportunities, diversifying my investment portfolio. That's nice, dear, my father said absently, already turning his attention back to his phone where he was reviewing surgical schedules for the upcoming week. Just remember what we've discussed about taking on too much debt. Real estate can be very volatile. Oh, I'm being very careful about leverage, I replied truthfully. In fact, I'm looking at some cash transactions that would eliminate financing risk entirely. My mother perked up slightly at this. Despite her low opinion of my business acumen, she'd inherited enough financial savvy from the Rodriguez family to appreciate the security of cash purchases. What kind of properties are you considering? Commercial real estate, actually. There are some interesting opportunities in the hospitality sector. Hospitality? My father looked up from his phone with mild interest. Like hotels? More like restaurants. Established businesses with strong customer bases but limited capital for growth. I watched their expressions carefully, noting the barely concealed skepticism that crossed both their faces. My mother set down her wine glass with the slight frown she reserved for occasions when I'd said something particularly naive. Elena, sweetie, the restaurant business is notoriously difficult. Even experienced operators struggle to make consistent profits. Are you sure you understand what you'd be getting into? I've been doing quite a bit of research, I said mildly. The key is finding businesses with solid fundamentals but temporary challenges that can be solved with adequate capital investment. Research is one thing, my father interjected, but actual experience is something entirely different. Running a restaurant requires skills you simply don't have. Customer service, staff management, inventory control, health department regulations. It's far more complex than flipping houses. The condescension in his voice was exactly what I'd been expecting, but it still stung. Here was a man who'd spent his entire career cutting into people's hearts, lecturing me about the complexity of serving them dinner. A man who'd never run anything more complicated than a surgical schedule, explaining why I couldn't possibly understand business operations. You're absolutely right, I agreed, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Restaurant management is incredibly complex. That's why any smart investor would want to keep experienced operators in place while providing the financial resources they need to succeed. My mother laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Oh, Elena, you make it sound so simple. But why would experienced restaurant managers want to work for someone with no industry experience? They'd be much better off finding investors who actually understand their business. Maybe, I said, taking another bite of the tiramisu that had been prepared in the kitchen I was planning to own within a month. I suppose we'll see how it works out. They exchanged one of their meaningful glances, the kind that had punctuated my childhood whenever I'd expressed ambitions they considered unrealistic. The same look they'd given each other when I'd announced my intention to study business instead of pre-med. The same look they'd shared when I'd told them about the tech startup, and again when I'd explained my move into real estate investment. Well, my father said with the patronizing smile he used for patients who insisted on second opinions. I suppose every failure is a learning experience. Just promise us you won't invest more than you can afford to lose. I promised, though what I didn't mention was that my definition of afford to lose had expanded considerably since my real estate investments had begun generating returns that exceeded my parents' combined annual income. I also didn't mention that I'd already received preliminary approval for the credit lines that would allow me to fund the Bella Vista acquisition without touching my existing investment portfolio. As I drove home from dinner, I reflected on the conversation and realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my parents' expectations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking their approval or trying to convince them that my plans made sense. I was simply executing a strategy that would speak for itself when the time came. They thought I didn't understand the complexity of restaurant operations? Perfect. They believed I lacked the experience and expertise to succeed in the hospitality industry? Even better. Their low expectations would make the eventual revelation even more satisfying, especially when it came in the form of a polite but firm letter explaining that their disappointing daughter now owned their favorite restaurant and had decided they were no longer welcome there. The Castellano family accepted my offer the following Tuesday. Giuseppe called me at 9 in the morning, his voice lighter than I'd heard it since our first meeting. Elena, we've discussed your proposal extensively, and we'd like to move forward. The terms you've outlined are more than fair, and frankly, they represent the kind of opportunity we never thought we'd have. I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with nervous energy. This was it, the point of no return in a plan that had started as an emotional reaction to my parents' casual cruelty and evolved into a serious business venture with real financial implications. I'm delighted to hear that, I said, pulling up the acquisition timeline I'd prepared weeks ago. I'd like to move quickly on this. How soon can we schedule a formal signing? Our attorney says we can have all the paperwork ready by Friday if your financing is already in place. My financing was indeed in place, thanks to a combination of liquid assets from my recent property sales and a business line of credit secured against my existing real estate portfolio. I'd learned to move quickly when the right opportunity presented itself, and the Bella Vista acquisition represented exactly the kind of strategic investment that my business education had taught me to recognize and execute. Friday works perfectly, I confirmed. I'll have my attorney coordinate with yours to finalize the purchase agreement and arrange for the funds transfer. After ending the call, I sat in my home office staring at the spreadsheets and business plans that represented months of careful research and strategic thinking. In 3 days, I would officially own the restaurant where my parents had spent 15 years celebrating their successes and dismissing mine. In 3 days, I would control the corner table where they'd held court about their important work while characterizing my business ventures as amusing hobbies. In 3 days, the balance of power in our relationship would shift in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. But first, I had some important decisions to make about how to manage the transition and, more importantly, how to handle the eventual confrontation that would define this entire endeavor. I spent Wednesday and Thursday meeting with the restaurant's key staff members, beginning with the management team that would be crucial to maintaining Bella Vista's operations during the ownership transition. Giuseppe had been right about the quality of the people working there. The head chef, Maria Santos, had been with the restaurant for 8 years and had developed many of the signature dishes that kept customers coming back. The general manager, Thomas Wright, understood both the operational challenges and the customer service standards that had made Bella Vista a local institution. "So you're really planning to keep everything the same?" Maria asked during our meeting in the restaurant's kitchen. "No menu changes, no staff cuts, no pressure to reduce food costs by using cheaper ingredients?" "My goal is to enhance what you've already built here, not to change it," I assured her. "I've seen too many restaurants fail because new owners tried to fix things that weren't broken. What I want to do is provide the financial stability and growth capital that will allow you to do your jobs even better." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Giuseppe mentioned that you've already negotiated a better lease arrangement. That alone will eliminate most of the financial pressure we've been operating under. The lease is just the beginning," I explained, pulling out the investment plan I'd developed. "I want to upgrade the kitchen equipment, expand the wine program, and implement a marketing strategy that will attract new customers while maintaining the loyalty of existing ones." What I didn't mention was that the marketing strategy would include some very specific changes to the restaurant's policies, particularly regarding customer acceptance and the management's discretion to refuse service to individuals who didn't meet the establishment's standards for respectful behavior. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Millbrook look like a postcard. I dressed carefully for the signing, choosing a tailored navy suit that projected exactly the right combination of professionalism and authority. This wasn't just a business transaction, it was a declaration of independence from 2 decades of being underestimated and dismissed. The signing took place at my attorney's office, with both legal teams present to ensure all documentation was properly executed. Giuseppe arrived with his siblings, all of them looking slightly stunned by the speed with which their family business was changing hands. The wire transfer of funds had been completed that morning, making the transaction official from a financial standpoint. "Elena," Giuseppe said as we shook hands after signing the final documents, "I have to say, this feels surreal. 3 weeks ago we were struggling to figure out how to keep the doors open. Now we're employees of a successful real estate investor who's committed to taking Bella Vista to the next level." "Sometimes the best opportunities come from unexpected directions," I replied, thinking about the chain of events that had led from my parents' casual dinner conversation to this moment. "I'm confident this is going to be beneficial for everyone involved." As I drove from the attorney's office to Bella Vista for my first visit as the owner, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of the day I'd closed on my first investment property. The difference was that this acquisition wasn't just about financial returns or portfolio diversification. This was about proving something to 2 people who had spent my entire life convinced that I'd never amount to anything significant. I pulled into the restaurant's parking lot and sat for a moment, looking at the elegant facade that I now owned. The brass nameplate beside the entrance, the carefully maintained landscaping, the warm light spilling from the windows. All of it was mine now, purchased with money I'd earned through the same business ventures my parents had dismissed as unrealistic fantasies. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Dinner reservation at Bella Vista tonight at 7. Dad wants to celebrate the hospital board's approval of his new surgical suite. Join us if you're free. I stared at the message, realizing that my parents had unknowingly scheduled their first meal at the restaurant I now owned. They would sit at their usual corner table, order their usual dishes, and discuss their usual topics, completely unaware that their disappointing daughter was now in a position to control every aspect of their dining experience. The irony was perfect, but the timing wasn't quite right. I needed a few more days to implement the changes that would make my ownership apparent, and to prepare for the conversation that would inevitably follow. More importantly, I needed to decide exactly how I wanted to handle the revelation that would forever change our family dynamic. I typed back a simple response. Can't make it tonight, but enjoy your dinner. As I walked through the front doors of my restaurant for the first time as its owner, I was already planning the perfect way to demonstrate to David and Patricia Hartwell exactly what their daughter had learned about business, about success, and about the kind of power that came from never giving up on yourself, even when the people who should have believed in you never bothered to try. The following Monday brought the first real test of my newfound authority as Bella Vista's owner. I arrived at the restaurant at 10 in the morning, 2 hours before the lunch service began, to meet with the entire staff and begin implementing the changes that would transform this establishment from merely an excellent restaurant into a statement about standards, respect, and the consequences of underestimating people. Thomas Wright had assembled everyone in the main dining room, from the experienced servers who had been working there for years, to the newest busboy who had started just 2 weeks ago. I looked around at the faces of the 23 people whose livelihoods now depended on my business decisions, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with ownership. These weren't just employees. They were skilled professionals who took pride in their work and deserved to be treated with the respect my parents had never shown me. Good morning, everyone, I began, standing beside the bar where I had spent so many evenings observing their operations. As Thomas has probably told you, there's been a change in ownership, but I want to assure you that my goal is to enhance what you've already built here, not to disrupt it. Maria Santos, the head chef, raised her hand. Are there going to be changes to the menu? Because we've spent years perfecting these recipes, and our regular customers have very specific expectations. The menu stays exactly as it is, I confirmed. In fact, I'm planning to expand it by adding some seasonal specials that will showcase your creativity while maintaining the quality and style that makes Bella Vista special. I could see the relief on several faces, particularly among the kitchen staff who had probably survived multiple ownership changes at other restaurants, and knew how quickly things could deteriorate when new owners started cutting costs or imposing their personal preferences on established operations. What about scheduling and benefits? Asked Janet Morrison, a server who had been with the restaurant since its early days. The Castellanos were always fair about time off and holiday pay. Your current benefits package will remain in place, and I'm actually planning to enhance it, I said, pulling out the employee handbook I'd spent the weekend revising. Starting next month, we'll be implementing a profit-sharing program that will give everyone a direct stake in the restaurant's success. I'm also adding health insurance subsidies and paid vacation time that increases with tenure. This announcement generated actual smiles and a few murmurs of approval. I'd learned from my business studies that employee satisfaction was directly correlated with customer satisfaction, and that investing in staff retention was one of the most cost-effective ways to maintain service quality while reducing training and recruitment costs. Now, I continued, there are going to be some policy changes that I want everyone to understand clearly. These changes reflect my commitment to maintaining Bella Vista as a place where both customers and staff are treated with dignity and respect. I distributed copies of the updated service policies, watching as they read through the sections I'd spent considerable time crafting. The most important addition was a new protocol for handling difficult customers, one that gave servers and management explicit authority to refuse service to anyone who treated staff disrespectfully or created a hostile environment for other diners. This is different from most restaurants, observed David Chen, the assistant manager who had been handling scheduling and inventory. Usually, management expects us to tolerate pretty much anything from customers, especially if they're regular patrons or big spenders. That ends now, I said firmly. I've seen too many service industry workers abused by customers who think money gives them the right to treat people badly. Anyone who can't treat our staff with basic human decency doesn't deserve to eat here, regardless of how much they're willing to spend. Thomas Wright nodded approvingly. I've had to bite my tongue more times than I can count when certain customers have been rude or condescending to our servers. It's going to be refreshing to know we can actually stand up for our team. Speaking of certain customers, I said, moving to the most delicate part of my announcement, there will be some changes to our reservation policies as well. Moving forward, we'll be implementing a more selective approach to customer acceptance, similar to what you might see at exclusive private clubs. I handed out the new reservation guidelines, which included provisions for maintaining a preferred customer list, establishing dress codes for different dining areas, and most importantly, giving management discretion to decline reservations or refuse service based on the restaurant's standards for maintaining a respectful atmosphere. What this means in practical terms, I explained, is that we'll be prioritizing customers who appreciate what we do here and treat everyone with respect. We'll be less accommodating to people who view dining out as an opportunity to demonstrate their superiority over service workers. Janet Morrison looked puzzled. Are you talking about specific customers? Because I have to say, most of our regulars are pretty decent people. Most of them are, I agreed. But there are a few who seem to think their spending gives them license to be demanding, dismissive, or downright rude. Those customers will be given the opportunity to adjust their behavior or find somewhere else to dine. I could see several staff members exchanging glances, probably thinking about particular customers who had made their jobs more difficult over the years. What they didn't know was that I had very specific customers in mind, and that the new policies had been designed with surgical precision to address a very particular problem. The important thing to remember, I continued, is that these changes are about maintaining standards, not about being arbitrary or vindictive. We want Bella Vista to be a place where excellent food and service create an atmosphere of mutual respect between staff and customers. After the staff meeting, I spent the rest of the day working with Thomas to implement the operational changes that would support my broader strategy. We updated the reservation system to flag customers who had previously been problematic, revised the staff training manual to include protocols for handling difficult situations, and established clear escalation procedures that empowered servers to seek management support without fear of being blamed for customer complaints. The most significant change was the implementation of a customer review system that would be used internally to track dining experiences from the staff perspective. If someone consistently treated servers poorly, made unreasonable demands, or created negative experiences for other diners, they would be flagged for special attention and potentially restricted from making future reservations. This is honestly revolutionary, Thomas said as we finished updating the computer system. I've been in restaurant management for 15 years, and I've never worked anywhere that gave staff this level of protection from abusive customers. It's just good business, I replied, though we both knew it was more than that. Happy employees provide better service, and better service creates a more pleasant atmosphere for everyone. What I didn't mention was that I'd already identified the first customers who would be affected by the new policies. Dr. David Hartwell and Mrs. Patricia Hartwell had a reservation for Thursday evening, their usual weekly dinner date, at their usual corner table. According to the staff members I'd spoken with privately, they were generally polite but had a tendency to be demanding about special requests and condescending in their interactions with servers. More importantly, they had never once acknowledged the staff as human beings worthy of basic courtesy. They ordered without saying please, received their food without saying thank you, and treated servers like invisible furniture whose only purpose was to facilitate their dining experience. It wasn't overtly abusive behavior, but it was exactly the kind of entitled attitude that my new policies were designed to address. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a blur of menu planning, staff training, and fine-tuning the operational changes that would make Bella Vista's transformation complete. I spent both evenings in the restaurant, observing service during the dinner rush and making notes about everything from table turnover rates to customer satisfaction indicators. The staff was adapting well to the new policies, and I could already see improvements in morale and service quality. Servers were more confident in their interactions with customers, knowing they had management support if situations became difficult. The kitchen staff was excited about the upgraded equipment I'd ordered, and the expanded budget for premium ingredients that would allow them to elevate already excellent dishes. But most importantly, I was preparing for Thursday evening's test case. The confrontation that would demonstrate to my parents exactly what their disappointing daughter had accomplished while they were busy dismissing her potential. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected complication. I was in my office above the restaurant, reviewing inventory reports and finalizing the weekend staffing schedule, when Thomas knocked on my door with a concerned expression. "Elena, we have a situation developing," he said, closing the door behind him. "I just got a call from Patricia Hartwell. She wants to change tonight's reservation from a table for 2 to a table for 6. Apparently they're bringing some out-of-town guests they want to impress." I felt a surge of irritation mixed with opportunity. My parents had decided to turn their weekly dinner into a performance, bringing witnesses to what they assumed would be another evening of demonstrating their social status and refined taste. They had no idea they were about to provide an audience for a very different kind of demonstration. "Did she say who the additional guests would be?" Thomas consulted his notes. "Dr. and Mrs. Richardson from Boston Children's Hospital, and another couple she identified as potential investors in some medical foundation project." I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. My parents weren't just bringing random friends to dinner. They were bringing professional contacts, people whose opinions could impact their careers and social standing. People who would witness whatever happened during their meal and carry that information back to their own professional networks. "Thomas, I need you to do something for me," I said, making a decision that would escalate my plan beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. "I want you to personally handle their table tonight. Take their order, oversee their service, and make sure everything appears to be proceeding normally." "Of course," he replied, though I could see curiosity in his expression. "Is there something specific I should be watching for?" "Just follow the new customer service protocols exactly as we've discussed them. Treat Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell like any other customers, and respond to their behavior according to our updated policies." What I didn't tell Thomas was that I'd already made arrangements to be present in the restaurant that evening, not as the owner reviewing operations, but as a customer observing the implementation of the standards I'd established. I'd reserved a table for myself in the section adjacent to where my parents would be seated, close enough to witness their behavior firsthand but positioned so they wouldn't immediately notice my presence. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what would either be a satisfying demonstration of justice or a complete disaster that would permanently damage my relationship with my parents. Either way, it would be definitive. After 28 years of being underestimated and dismissed, I was finally going to show David and Patricia Hartwell exactly what their daughter was capable of achieving. That evening, I arrived at Bella Vista at 6:30, 30 minutes before my parents' 7 o'clock reservation. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing an elegant black dress that was sophisticated enough for fine dining, but understated enough to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. This wasn't about making a grand entrance. It was about observing and responding to whatever transpired during their meal. Thomas seated me at a corner table with a clear view of the dining room but partially concealed by a decorative column that would prevent my parents from immediately spotting me. I ordered a glass of wine and the evening's special appetizer, settling in to wait for what promised to be the most significant family dinner in our history. At exactly 7 o'clock, the hostess led a party of 6 to the corner table, where my parents had been holding court for 15 years. I recognized Dr. and Mrs. Richardson from photos I'd seen in medical journals. He was a prominent pediatric surgeon whose reputation extended well beyond Boston, and she was a successful fundraiser for children's medical charities. The other couple appeared to be wealthy socialites, the kind of people my parents cultivated for their charitable foundation and social advancement projects. My parents looked exactly as I'd expected. My father in his usual navy blazer and perfectly pressed khakis. My mother wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. They moved through the restaurant with the confident familiarity of people who considered Bella Vista an extension of their personal domain, greeting other diners with polite nods and settling into their seats with the assumption that everything would proceed exactly as it always had. Thomas approached their table with professional courtesy, welcoming them to Bella Vista and beginning to explain the evening's specials. I watched my parents' behavior carefully, noting the subtle signs of condescension I'd learned to recognize over the years. My father interrupted Thomas twice, to ask questions that demonstrated his medical knowledge rather than genuine interest in the food. My mother corrected the pronunciation of an Italian wine name in a tone that suggested Thomas was ignorant, rather than simply mispronouncing an unfamiliar word. The Richardson couple and the other guests seemed slightly uncomfortable with my parents' behavior, exchanging glances that suggested they weren't accustomed to treating service staff as inferior beings. This was promising. It meant they would notice and potentially disapprove of any escalation in my parents' entitled attitude. The first course proceeded without incident, though I noticed my mother making several special requests that weren't unreasonable but were delivered in a demanding tone that treated Thomas like hired help rather than a skilled professional. She wanted her salad dressing on the side, extra bread for the table, and a different wine glass because the first one had water spots. Each request was prefaced with commands rather than polite inquiries. Bring me the dressing separately. We need more bread immediately. This glass is unacceptable. No please, no thank you, no acknowledgement that Thomas was a human being deserving of basic courtesy. Thomas handled each request professionally, but I could see the subtle signs of irritation that my new policies were designed to address. Under the old management, he would have had no choice but to tolerate this treatment while maintaining a smile and pretending that demanding, condescending customers were just part of the job. The main course brought the moment I'd been waiting for. My mother had ordered the restaurant's signature osso buco, the same dish she'd been enjoying while discussing my supposed failures just weeks earlier. When Thomas presented the plate, she examined it with the critical eye of someone looking for problems rather than appreciating excellence. "This is not prepared correctly," she announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "The sauce is too thin and the meat appears overcooked. I specifically asked for it to be prepared medium rare." Thomas maintained his professional composure, though I knew from my conversations with the kitchen staff that osso buco was always braised until tender, making medium rare preparation both impossible and inadvisable. "Ma'am, osso buco is traditionally braised slowly until the meat falls off the bone. It's not typically served medium rare, like a steak." My mother's voice took on the sharp edge I remembered from childhood corrections. "Young man, I've been dining at fine restaurants longer than you've been alive. I know how osso buco should be prepared, and this is not acceptable." The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other tables, exactly the kind of scene that disrupted the pleasant atmosphere Bella Vista had built its reputation on. Dr. Richardson looked embarrassed. His wife was staring at her own plate to avoid making eye contact, and the other guests were clearly uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation. This was the moment my new policies were designed to address. Thomas had several options under the updated customer service protocols. He could offer to have the dish re-prepared. He could involve management in resolving the complaint. Or if the customer's behavior was sufficiently disruptive, he could implement the enhanced response procedures I'd established. "I'd be happy to speak with our chef about your concerns," Thomas said diplomatically. "Perhaps we can find a solution that meets your expectations." "What I expect," my mother said with increasing volume, "is competent service and properly prepared food. This establishment has clearly declined since the ownership change, and I'm beginning to understand why." The reference to the ownership change sent a chill down my spine. Somehow, my mother had learned about the Castellano family's sale of the restaurant, though she obviously had no idea who the new owner was. Her comment suggested she was planning to use Bella Vista's transition as an explanation for any service issues, positioning herself as a loyal customer disappointed by declining standards. "Ma'am," Thomas said, his voice remaining calm but taking on a slightly firmer tone, "I need to ask you to lower your voice. Your conversation is disrupting other diners' experiences." This was it. The moment when my mother would either moderate her behavior like a reasonable person or escalate into the kind of entitled tantrum that demonstrated exactly why the new policies were necessary. She chose escalation. "Excuse me?" my mother said, her voice rising even higher. "Are you actually trying to tell me how to behave? I have been a loyal customer of this restaurant for 15 years. I have spent thousands of dollars here, brought countless guests, and recommended Bella Vista to everyone in my social circle. I will speak as loudly as I choose, and if you don't like it, perhaps you should find another job." The dining room had gone quiet, with conversations stopping at nearby tables, as other customers turned to watch the confrontation unfolding at the corner table. Dr. Richardson was visibly mortified, his face flushed with embarrassment at being associated with the scene my mother was creating. His wife had abandoned any pretense of eating and was staring at my mother with undisguised disapproval. Thomas looked toward my table, and I gave him a subtle nod. It was time to implement the protocols we discussed, the policies that would demonstrate exactly what kind of standards Elena Rodriguez Hartwell expected in her establishment. "Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room, "I'm going to have to ask you to settle your bill and leave. Your behavior is unacceptable, and it's disrupting the dining experience for other customers." The silence that followed was deafening. My father, who had been largely quiet during my mother's tantrum, looked stunned by the idea that their patronage could be refused. My mother's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested she was either having a stroke or preparing to explode. "This is outrageous," she managed to say, though her voice had dropped to a more reasonable volume. "You cannot throw out paying customers. I demand to speak to your manager immediately." "I am the manager on duty, tonight," Thomas replied calmly, "and the owner has made it very clear that we will not tolerate customers who treat our staff disrespectfully or create disruptions for other diners." The mention of the owner sent another wave of tension through the situation. My parents had no idea they were being ejected from their favorite restaurant by policies implemented by their own daughter, the disappointing child they'd spent years dismissing as incapable of significant success. "The owner?" my father said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "I want to speak to the owner right now. This is completely unacceptable, and I guarantee you that your new ownership will hear about this incident." I stood up from my table, smoothing my dress and walking slowly across the dining room toward the corner where my parents sat with their humiliated guests. Every eye in the restaurant was on me as I approached, and I could see the exact moment when recognition dawned on my parents' faces. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room, "the owner is already here." The expression on my mother's face was worth every dollar I'd spent acquiring Bella Vista, every hour I'd invested in research and planning, every moment of doubt I'd experienced about whether this confrontation was worth the potential damage to our family relationship. She looked like someone who had just realized that the ground beneath her feet had been steadily eroding for months, and she was only now noticing that she was standing in mid-air. "Elena?" my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I'm having dinner in my restaurant," I replied, letting the words sink in. "The restaurant I purchased 2 weeks ago. The restaurant where you've just been asked to leave for treating my staff with disrespect." Dr. Richardson and his wife were staring at me with fascination, clearly trying to process the family drama unfolding before them. The other couple looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs, and my parents looked like they were trying to wake up from a nightmare that kept getting worse. "Your restaurant?" my mother managed to say. "That's impossible. You don't have the money or experience to buy a place like this." I smiled, thinking about all the times I'd heard variations of that dismissive certainty. "Actually, I do. The tech startup you called a get-rich-quick scheme generated enough profit to fund my real estate investments. The house-flipping projects you dismissed as hobbies have been consistently profitable for over a year. And the business education you thought was beneath me taught me how to analyze opportunities like Bella Vista and execute acquisitions successfully." The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Thomas stood beside their table, waiting for direction about how to proceed. The other diners in the restaurant were watching with the rapt attention usually reserved for dramatic performances. And my parents sat frozen in their chairs, trying to process a reality that contradicted everything they'd believed about their daughter's capabilities. "This is some kind of mistake," my father said finally. "Elena, if you're involved in this purchase somehow, we can work out whatever misunderstanding has occurred. You know we support your business ventures." "Support them?" I laughed, the sound carrying more bitterness than I'd intended. "Dad, 3 weeks ago, I heard you tell Margaret Chen that I was unremarkable, that I'd never amount to anything significant, and that you'd given up hope of me ever achieving real success. My mother's face went pale. You were eavesdropping on a private conversation. I was standing in the entrance of this restaurant, listening to you casually destroy my reputation while enjoying the osso buco you just complained about. I turned to address Dr. Richardson and his companions, who were still staring at the unfolding drama. I apologize for this disruption to your evening. Your meals are complimentary, of course, and I hope you'll give us another opportunity to provide the kind of dining experience Bella Vista is known for. Dr. Richardson nodded politely, though I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed what he'd just witnessed. These were my parents' professional contacts, people whose opinions could impact their standing in the medical community. And they'd just seen David and Patricia Hartwell get ejected from a restaurant by their own daughter for treating service staff badly. Elena, my father said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when delivering medical opinions. Whatever you think you heard, I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding. We've always been proud of your accomplishments. Have you? I asked, pulling out my phone. Because I have recordings of several conversations where you express very different opinions about my potential for success. This was a bluff. I hadn't actually recorded their dinner conversation weeks ago, but the threat was enough to make both my parents go rigid with anxiety about what evidence I might possess of their private discussions about my supposed failures. Thomas, I said, turning to my manager, please prepare Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell's bill. I think they'll be more comfortable dining elsewhere in the future. Elena, please, my mother said, her voice finally losing the imperious tone she'd used with Thomas. Let's discuss this privately. This is embarrassing for everyone. Embarrassing? I repeated. You mean like it was embarrassing when you told Margaret Chen that I was ordinary and unremarkable? Like it was embarrassing when you suggested I'd never achieve anything significant? Like it was embarrassing when you called my business ventures get-rich-quick schemes? Each question landed like a physical blow, and I could see my parents realizing that their private conversations hadn't been as private as they'd assumed. They were also beginning to understand that their disappointing daughter had not only overheard their cruel assessments, but had spent weeks planning a response that would demonstrate exactly how wrong they'd been. We never meant to hurt you, my father said, though his words lacked conviction. Sometimes parents express concerns privately that they wouldn't share publicly. Concerns? I said. Dad, you didn't express concerns. You wrote me off completely. You decided I was a failure before I'd even had a chance to succeed, and then you used that assumption to justify treating me like a disappointment for years. The other diners in the restaurant were no longer pretending to ignore our conversation. This was better than dinner theater, a real-life family drama playing out in front of them, with all the intensity of a scripted performance. I could see people pulling out their phones, probably recording video that would be shared on social media within hours. Thomas cleared his throat politely. Elena, would you like me to have their bill prepared? I looked at my parents, sitting in the corner where they'd held court for 15 years, now reduced to unwelcome customers, being ejected from their favorite restaurant by the daughter they'd never believed in. The irony was so perfect it almost felt scripted. Actually, I said, making a decision that would cement this moment in family history forever, their meal is complimentary tonight. Consider it a farewell dinner. Dr. and Mrs. Hartwell are no longer welcome at Bella Vista. My mother gasped audibly. You're banning us? From our favorite restaurant? I'm implementing the customer standards I've established for my business, I corrected. Customers who treat my staff disrespectfully, who create disruptions for other diners, and who fail to meet basic standards of human decency, are not welcome here. Dr. Richardson stood up from his chair, clearly uncomfortable with being associated with the scene that had unfolded. Perhaps we should continue our discussion elsewhere, he suggested to my father. Yes, I agreed. That would be best for everyone. As my parents' dinner companions began gathering their belongings, preparing to leave with them, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that surprised me. This wasn't just about proving my business success or getting revenge for years of dismissive treatment. This was about drawing a line between the daughter who had spent 28 years seeking approval from people who would never give it, and the woman who had finally stopped caring whether they approved of her choices. "Elena," my mother said as she stood to leave, "I hope you realize what you've done tonight. This isn't just about dinner. You've damaged our family permanently." "No," I replied quietly. "You did that years ago when you decided I wasn't worth believing in. I just finally stopped pretending it didn't matter." As I watched my parents leave Bella Vista for the last time, walking past the staff members they'd treated as invisible and the other diners who had witnessed their humiliation, I felt something I'd never experienced before in their presence. I felt free. The immediate aftermath of my parents' ejection from Bella Vista was more intense than I'd anticipated. As soon as their party left the restaurant, the dining room buzzed with conversation about what everyone had just witnessed. Several customers approached me to express support for my decision, sharing their own stories about difficult family dynamics and business challenges they'd overcome, despite lack of family support. "I have to say," commented Mrs. Foster, an elderly woman who dined at Bella Vista regularly with her book club, "it takes real strength to stand up to family members who don't appreciate your worth." "Good for you, dear." Thomas appeared at my side as I returned to my table, his expression combining professional concern with personal admiration. "Elena, are you all right? That was incredibly intense." "I'm better than all right," I said, and realized I meant it completely. "How did the staff handle everything?" "They're amazed," he replied. "Most of them have dealt with difficult customers for years without any recourse. Seeing you actually enforce standards and protect your employees, that's going to change the entire culture here." As the evening progressed, I noticed a subtle but significant shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. The staff moved with more confidence, interacting with customers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation with enhanced professionalism and pride. Word had clearly spread among the employees that their new owner would actually stand behind the policies she'd established, that this wasn't just empty rhetoric about respecting workers. Maria Santos emerged from the kitchen during a brief lull in service, still wearing her chef's coat and looking slightly emotional. "Elena, I wanted to thank you for what you did tonight. I've been cooking professionally for 12 years, and I've never worked anywhere that the ownership actually supported staff when customers were abusive." "It's just good business," I replied, though we both knew it was more than that. "Happy employees create better experiences for everyone." "Maybe," she said with a smile, "but it's also just the right thing to do." I spent the rest of the evening observing service and taking notes about operational improvements, but my mind kept returning to the moment when recognition had dawned on my parents' faces. The shock, the disbelief, and ultimately the realization that their assumptions about my capabilities had been not just wrong but spectacularly publicly wrong. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening. News of the confrontation was spreading through Millbrook's social circles with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Some messages were from friends expressing support and amazement. Others were from business contacts who had heard about the acquisition and wanted to congratulate me on what several described as a brilliant move. But it was the message from Dr. Richardson that surprised me most. He'd apparently obtained my contact information from someone and sent a thoughtful note acknowledging what he'd witnessed. "Ms. Rodriguez Hartwell, I wanted to reach out after tonight's dinner to express my admiration for how you handled a very difficult situation. Your commitment to treating employees with dignity while maintaining professional standards is exactly what we need more of in business. I'd be interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities between your restaurant and our upcoming fundraising events." The irony was delicious. My parents had brought Dr. Richardson to Bella Vista to impress him with their social connections and refined taste. Instead, he'd been impressed by their daughter's business acumen and ethical standards, enough to suggest working together professionally. As the restaurant closed and the last customers departed, I found myself alone in the dining room with Thomas, reviewing the evening's events and planning for the changes that would inevitably follow. "So what happens now?" he asked as we locked the front doors. "Are you expecting retaliation from your parents?" I considered this question carefully. My parents weren't vindictive people, but they were proud, and what had happened tonight represented a fundamental challenge to their worldview and social standing. They would need to process not just the personal humiliation, but the professional implications of being publicly confronted by their own daughter. "They'll probably try to repair the relationship," I said finally. but on their terms, with expectations that I should apologize for embarrassing them and allow them to return to their regular dining routine. And will you? I looked around the restaurant that I now owned, thinking about the journey that had brought me from an underestimated daughter to a successful business owner who controlled something her parents valued. No, the standards I've established here aren't negotiable, and they apply to everyone equally. The following morning brought a flood of phone calls and messages that confirmed how quickly news of the previous evening's events had spread through Millbrook's interconnected social and professional networks. My parents' public ejection from Bella Vista had become the talk of the town, with various versions of the story circulating through medical circles, charity organizations, and social clubs. My business phone rang constantly with calls from local reporters wanting to interview me about the acquisition and the incident with my parents. I declined most interview requests, preferring to let my actions speak for themselves, but I did agree to speak with the business reporter from the Millbrook Daily Herald about my expansion into the hospitality industry. Ms. Rodriguez Hartwell, the reporter asked during our phone interview, what prompted your decision to acquire Bella Vista? Was this part of a larger business strategy, or more of a personal investment? Bella Vista represented exactly the kind of opportunity I look for, I replied carefully. An established business with excellent fundamentals but limited capital for growth. My role is to provide financial resources and strategic guidance while preserving what makes the restaurant special. And the incident last night with your parents? How do you respond to suggestions that this was more about family drama than business standards? I'd anticipated this question and had prepared my response. Every business owner has to establish standards for customer behavior that protect their employees and maintain a positive atmosphere for other patrons. Those standards apply equally to everyone, regardless of personal relationships or history with the establishment. What I didn't mention was that I'd already begun researching other acquisition opportunities in Millbrook's hospitality sector. The success of the Bella Vista purchase, combined with the positive publicity from my commitment to employee protection, had generated interest from other restaurant owners facing similar challenges with financing and growth capital. By noon, I'd received 3 inquiries from local business owners interested in discussing potential partnerships or acquisitions. Word was spreading that Elena Rodriguez Hartwell was a serious investor with both the resources and the ethical standards that could help struggling businesses achieve stability and growth. My personal phone remained suspiciously quiet, however. No calls or messages from either of my parents, despite the fact that their daughter had just made the biggest business acquisition of her career and had become the talk of their social circle. Their silence spoke volumes about their ability to prioritize their wounded pride over any acknowledgement of my professional achievement. That afternoon, I drove to the restaurant to meet with an interior designer about refreshing the decor in ways that would honor Bella Vista's history while reflecting its new ownership. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a familiar Mercedes sedan parked near the entrance. My father's car. I found him sitting alone at the bar, nursing a cup of coffee and looking older than I'd ever seen him. He'd aged visibly since the previous evening, the confident bearing that came from a lifetime of professional success replaced by something that looked remarkably like uncertainty. "Elena," he said as I approached, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't agree to anything," I replied, taking the stool beside him. "You're in my restaurant without permission." Thomas appeared from the kitchen, looking concerned about the potential for another confrontation. I gave him a subtle nod indicating that I could handle the situation, and he retreated to a respectful distance while remaining visible in case I needed support. "Your restaurant," my father repeated, shaking his head. "I still can't quite believe it. How did you finance something like this? The Castellano family would have wanted at least $3 million for this place." "I had the capital," I said simply. "My business ventures have been more successful than you realized." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Elena, I owe you an apology. What your mother and I said, what you overheard, that wasn't fair to you." "It wasn't just unfair, Dad. It was cruel. And more importantly, it was wrong." "Yes," he admitted, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. "It was wrong. We made assumptions about your potential based on our own limited understanding of your goals and abilities." I studied his face, looking for signs that this apology was genuine rather than strategic. My father had spent his career managing relationships with patients, families, and colleagues, and he was skilled at saying what people needed to hear to achieve desired outcomes. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" I asked. "For saying those things, or for me finding out you said them?" He looked up from his coffee, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since I'd arrived. "For saying them, for believing them, for treating our daughter like a disappointment, instead of recognizing that you were building something we were too narrow-minded to appreciate." The conversation with my father stretched on for nearly 2 hours, covering decades of misunderstandings, missed opportunities for connection, and the fundamental differences in how we measured success and worth. He spoke about the pressure he'd felt to guide me toward what he considered stable, respectable careers, admitting that his own narrow definition of achievement had blinded him to the entrepreneurial skills I'd been developing. "I spent so many years focused on traditional markers of success," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Medical degrees, prestigious positions, social recognition. I couldn't see that you were creating something entirely different, something that required skills I'd never developed myself." "The irony," I replied, "is that everything you taught me about precision, attention to detail, and systematic problem-solving contributed to my business success. You just couldn't recognize those skills when they were applied to ventures you didn't understand." My father nodded slowly. "Your mother and we operated from fear more than we realized. Fear that you'd struggle, that you'd fail, that you'd end up disappointed by unrealistic expectations. We thought we were protecting you by steering you toward conventional paths." "But you weren't protecting me," I said quietly. "You were protecting yourselves from the anxiety of watching me take risks. And in the process, you convinced yourselves that I was incapable of handling those risks successfully." As our conversation continued, I began to see my father not as the confident authority figure of my childhood, but as a man who had achieved success within a very specific framework and struggled to understand achievement that didn't fit his established patterns. His apology was genuine, but it came with the realization that our relationship would need to be rebuilt from fundamentally different assumptions about my capabilities and choices. "Elena," he said finally, "I know an apology can't erase years of making you feel inadequate. But I want you to know that what you've accomplished here, what you did last night, it opened my eyes to who you really are. Not the daughter I thought I was raising, but the woman you actually became despite my limitations as a father." "I appreciate that, Dad," I said, and meant it. But appreciation and understanding are different things. You can respect what I've built without really comprehending how I built it or why it matters to me. He finished his coffee and stood to leave, looking around the restaurant with new eyes. "May I ask you something? The ban you've implemented, is that permanent?" I considered his question carefully. The ban wasn't really about punishment. It was about establishing boundaries that protected both my staff and my own sense of self-worth. "That depends on whether you and Mom can demonstrate that you understand why your behavior was unacceptable and make genuine changes in how you treat service workers. And if we can, then we'll see. But understand, Dad, this isn't about earning your way back into my restaurant. This is about learning to treat people with basic human dignity, regardless of whether they're serving your food or performing your surgery." 3 months later, Bella Vista had become the most sought-after dining reservation in Millbrook. The combination of excellent food, exceptional service, and a reputation for maintaining high standards had attracted customers from neighboring cities and generated recognition from regional food critics. More importantly, the restaurant had become profitable enough to fund the expansion projects I'd envisioned, including a private dining room for special events and a wine cellar that would house an even more impressive collection. The success had also validated my broader strategy for entering the hospitality industry. I'd acquired 2 additional restaurants in the past month, both following the same model of purchasing established businesses with strong fundamentals but limited growth capital. My real estate portfolio had evolved into a comprehensive business empire that included commercial properties, residential investments, and now a growing collection of dining establishments. But the most significant change was in my relationship with my parents. My father had begun meeting me for coffee every few weeks, conversations that felt more like interactions between equals than the parent-child dynamic that had dominated our previous relationship. He asked thoughtful questions about my business decisions, shared insights from his own experience managing teams and making strategic choices, and gradually demonstrated that he was beginning to understand the complexity and skill required for successful entrepreneurship. My mother's journey toward understanding had been more difficult. The public nature of her ejection from Bella Vista had damaged her social standing in ways that challenged her entire identity as a sophisticated, well-connected member of Millbrook's elite. Several of her charity board positions had become uncomfortable as word spread about the incident, and she'd been forced to confront the reality that her reputation for graciousness and refinement had been built on a foundation of conditional kindness that extended only to people she considered her social equals. It was during one of my regular evening visits to the restaurant that Thomas informed me my parents had made a reservation request. "They called this afternoon," he explained. "Your father was very polite, very respectful. He said they understood the standards you'd established and wanted to know if they could earn an opportunity to dine here again." I felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Part of me wanted to maintain the ban indefinitely, to preserve the symbolic victory that had marked my independence from their approval. But another part of me recognized that growth, both personal and professional, required the ability to reassess decisions as circumstances changed. "What did you tell them?" "I said I'd need to discuss it with you, and that any reservation would be contingent on their demonstrating the kind of respectful behavior we expect from all customers." That evening, I called my father to discuss their request. The conversation was tentative but respectful, with both of us acknowledging how much our relationship had changed since that confrontational night months earlier. "Elena," he said, "we understand that we need to earn the privilege of dining at your restaurant. We've both spent considerable time thinking about our behavior, not just that night, but over the years with service workers everywhere. We want the opportunity to demonstrate that we've learned from our mistakes." "This isn't about proving anything to me, Dad," I replied. "It's about treating my staff with the same respect you'd show to colleagues in your own profession. We understand that now, and we want to try." I granted them a reservation for the following Friday evening, with the explicit understanding that this was a trial run rather than a complete lifting of the ban. Thomas would monitor their behavior closely, and any signs of the entitled, condescending attitude they displayed previously would result in their immediate removal and permanent exclusion from the restaurant. Friday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had customers requesting tables on the patio rather than in the main dining room. I positioned myself at a corner table inside, close enough to observe my parents' behavior but far enough away to avoid making them feel like they were performing under a microscope. They arrived precisely on time, dressed appropriately, but not ostentatiously, and approached the hostess station with obvious nervousness. I watched as my father introduced himself politely, thanked the hostess for accommodating their reservation, and waited patiently to be seated rather than demanding their preferred table. Thomas greeted them professionally but warmly, explaining the evening's specials without interruption, and taking their drink orders with the same courtesy he extended to every customer. My mother listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions about the wine selection, and thanked him using the kind of language she'd normally reserve for people she considered her social equals. Throughout their meal, I observed subtle but significant changes in their behavior. They said please and thank you consistently. They made eye contact with servers and addressed them by name after reading their name tags. When my mother had a question about an ingredient in her dish, she phrased it as a request for information rather than a complaint about preparation. Most importantly, they treated Thomas and the other staff members as skilled professionals deserving of respect rather than as invisible servants, whose only purpose was to facilitate their dining experience. The transformation wasn't perfect, and I could see moments when their old habits almost reasserted themselves, but they consistently corrected their behavior and maintained the standards I'd established. Near the end of their meal, my father approached my table, moving slowly and keeping his voice low to avoid disrupting other diners. "Elena, may I speak with you for a moment?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me, noting that he waited for permission rather than simply sitting down. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "not just for allowing us to return, but for teaching us something we should have learned decades ago. The way we treated service workers, the casual dismissiveness, the entitled attitude, We never recognized how cruel and dehumanizing that behavior was until we experienced consequences for it. I'm glad you understand that now, I replied. But this wasn't really about teaching lessons, Dad. It was about protecting my employees and maintaining standards in my business. I know, but the lesson was valuable anyway. He paused, looking around the restaurant with obvious pride. What you've built here, Elena, it's extraordinary. Not just the business success, but the culture you've created. Employees who feel valued. Customers who appreciate excellence. Standards that actually mean something. As my parents prepared to leave that evening, they stopped at the hostess station to express their appreciation for the service they'd received. My mother engaged in a brief but genuine conversation with one of the servers about the evening's special dessert, and my father left a tip that reflected both the quality of service and his recognition of the staff's professionalism. Over the following months, they became regular customers again, but their presence felt entirely different from the entitled performance they'd previously brought to their weekly dinners. They made reservations like everyone else, accepted whatever table was available, and treated every interaction with staff as an opportunity to demonstrate the respect and courtesy they'd learned to value. The change extended beyond their behavior at Bella Vista. My mother began approaching her charity work with a new awareness of how her attitude affected the people who served on committees, organized events, and implemented her fundraising initiatives. My father started acknowledging the contributions of nurses, technicians, and support staff at the hospital in ways that recognized their expertise rather than simply their assistance. 6 months after their return to Bella Vista, my parents hosted a dinner party at the restaurant to celebrate my father's promotion to chief of cardiology. The guest list included many of the same medical professionals and social contacts who had witnessed their original ejection, creating an opportunity for them to demonstrate how much their attitudes and behavior had evolved. I watched from my usual observation post as they interacted with Thomas and the serving staff throughout the evening. Every exchange was marked by courtesy, appreciation, and genuine warmth that had been absent from their previous interactions. When one of their guests made a dismissive comment about the server's knowledge of wine pairings, my mother quickly corrected him and praised the expertise of Bella Vista staff. The evening represented more than just a successful dinner party. It was a public demonstration that people could learn, grow, and change their fundamental attitudes when confronted with the consequences of their behavior. My parents had evolved from entitled customers who viewed service workers as inferior beings to people who understood that treating others with dignity was both morally correct and personally enriching. But perhaps the most significant change was in my own relationship with success and validation. The young woman who had overheard her parents' cruel assessment of her potential had been desperate for their approval and recognition. The business owner who now controlled multiple successful enterprises no longer needed their validation to feel confident about her achievements. I had built something substantial and meaningful without their support, demonstrated capabilities they'd never recognized, and created opportunities for myself that exceeded anything they'd envisioned for my future. Their eventual understanding and respect was gratifying, but it wasn't necessary for my sense of self-worth or professional confidence. The final vindication came not from their apologies or changed behavior, but from the recognition that I had succeeded not because of their guidance but despite their limitations. The disappointment daughter they'd dismissed had become exactly what she'd always been capable of becoming once she stopped seeking permission from people who lacked the vision to see her potential. 1 year after acquiring Bella Vista, I stood in the restaurant's expanded private dining room, hosting a reception for the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce's Entrepreneur of the Year award. The recognition came with a substantial cash prize and invitations to speak at business conferences throughout the region, but more importantly, it represented acknowledgement from my professional community that the venture into hospitality had been not just successful, but transformative for the local business environment. My parents attended the reception, mingling comfortably with other business leaders and civic officials who had come to celebrate my achievements. I watched my father engaging in animated conversation with the mayor about economic development initiatives, and my mother discussing fundraising strategies with the head of the local arts council. "Elena," my mother said as she approached me near the end of the evening, "I need to tell you something I should have said months ago. When you bought this restaurant, when you stood up to us that night, I thought you were being vindictive and destructive. I couldn't understand why you would risk our family relationship for a business transaction." She paused, looking around the room filled with people celebrating my success. "Now I realize that you weren't destroying our relationship. You were demanding that it be based on truth, instead of the fiction we'd created about your capabilities and worth. You forced us to see who you really are, instead of who we assumed you were." "And who am I?" I asked, genuinely curious about her current assessment. "You're someone who builds things that matter. Someone who creates opportunities for others while refusing to accept limitations that other people try to impose. Someone who has the courage to risk everything to prove that she's capable of more than anyone expected." She smiled, the expression free of the condescension that had marked her previous attempts at maternal pride. "You're someone I'm genuinely proud to call my daughter." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who approached with a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. "I thought you might want to toast the evening," he said, filling the glasses with obvious pleasure. "It's not every day that your boss wins Entrepreneur of the Year." "Actually," I said, accepting my glass and raising it toward my parents, "I think we should toast something even more important. To learning that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to build relationships based on mutual respect instead of assumed hierarchies." My parents raised their glasses, understanding that this moment represented not just celebration of my business success, but acknowledgement of how much we had all evolved since that confrontational evening when their disappointing daughter had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person who amounts to something significant. As the reception wound down and guests began departing, I remained in the private dining room with Thomas, reviewing the evening's events and planning for the expansion projects that would mark Bella Vista's continued growth. The restaurant had become more than just a successful business venture. It had become a symbol of what could be accomplished when someone refused to accept other people's limitations on their potential. "You know," Thomas said as we gathered the last of the awards and recognition certificates, "when you first told us about your vision for this place, about creating an environment where employees felt valued and customers earned their welcome, I thought it sounded idealistic. But you've actually done it." "We've done it," I corrected. "This success belongs to everyone who believed that treating people with dignity would create something worth building." The following morning brought news that would extend the impact of the previous evening's recognition far beyond Millbrook's business community. A regional business magazine wanted to feature my story in their upcoming issue about innovative entrepreneurs, focusing on how the acquisition and transformation of Bella Vista had demonstrated new approaches to hospitality industry investment. The article would include interviews with staff members about the employee-centered policies that had contributed to the restaurant's success, customers who had witnessed the evolution of service standards, and industry experts who viewed my business model as a template for sustainable growth in the hospitality sector. But it was the personal section of the interview that I found most interesting to discuss. The reporter wanted to explore how family dynamics had influenced my approach to business ownership, particularly the decision to prioritize employee dignity over customer privilege regardless of personal relationships or social pressure. "Ms. Rodriguez-Hartwell," the reporter asked during our phone interview, "your approach to customer standards has generated considerable attention, both positive and negative. Some people view your policies as refreshing accountability, while others see them as unnecessarily rigid. How do you respond to criticism that you're too willing to alienate profitable customers?" "I respond by pointing to our financial results," I said confidently. "Bella Vista is more profitable now than it was under previous ownership, despite implementing stricter customer standards. We've demonstrated that treating employees well and maintaining high expectations for customer behavior actually improves the bottom line rather than hurting it. And the personal aspects of your story, the well-publicized incident with your parents, how has that affected your business relationships and family dynamics?" I considered this question carefully, knowing that my response would be quoted and analyzed by people who were curious about the intersection of family relationships and business decisions. "The incident with my parents wasn't about family drama," I said finally. "It was about applying business standards consistently, regardless of personal relationships. Any successful enterprise requires the ability to prioritize principles over convenience, even when that creates short-term complications. Have those family relationships been permanently damaged? No, they've been permanently improved." My parents learned to treat service workers with respect, and I learned that my success doesn't require their approval. Those are both positive developments that have strengthened our relationship in the long term. The article was published 3 months later, generating interview requests from business schools, hospitality industry conferences, and entrepreneurship organizations throughout the region. The combination of financial success and ethical leadership had created a case study that resonated with people who believed that profitable businesses could also be socially responsible enterprises. But the most satisfying response came from other entrepreneurs who had implemented similar policies in their own businesses after reading about Bella Vista's success. Restaurant owners began adopting customer standards that protected employees from abusive behavior. Retail establishments started training managers to support staff when dealing with difficult customers. Service businesses across multiple industries began recognizing that employee dignity and customer privilege were not mutually exclusive concepts. The ripple effects of that confrontational evening had extended far beyond my personal vindication or family relationships. They had demonstrated that business success and ethical treatment of workers could coexist, and that entrepreneurs had both the power and responsibility to create workplace cultures that reflected their values. 2 years after acquiring Bella Vista, I stood before a packed auditorium at the State University's business school, delivering a keynote address about entrepreneurship, family expectations, and the courage required to succeed despite other people's limitations on your potential. The audience included business students, faculty members, and practicing entrepreneurs who had come to hear about the journey from underestimated daughter to recognized business leader. The most important lesson I can share, I told the audience, is that other people's assumptions about your capabilities say more about their limitations than yours. Success requires the ability to see opportunities that others miss, to persist when others give up, and to maintain your standards even when others pressure you to compromise them. A student raised her hand during the question period. Ms. Rodriguez Hartwell, what advice would you give to someone whose family doesn't support their entrepreneurial ambitions? I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought me from my parents' dismissive dinner conversation to this moment of recognition and respect. Build something so successful that their opinions become irrelevant, I said. And then, if they're capable of growth, help them understand why they were wrong. But never make your success contingent on their approval, because that gives them power over achievements they didn't contribute to creating. After the presentation, I drove to Bella Vista for my weekly dinner with my parents, a tradition we'd established after their return to the restaurant's good graces. The conversation had evolved from their previous monologues about their important work to genuine exchanges about business challenges, family relationships, and the unexpected ways that success could emerge from situations that initially appeared to be failures. Elena, my father said as we finished sharing the tiramisu that had become our traditional ending to these dinners, I want you to know that your mother and I have been discussing something important. What's that? We want to invest in your next acquisition. Not as silent partners, but as active supporters who understand what you're building and want to be part of it. I looked at both of them, seeing people who had evolved from dismissive parents into respectful partners who finally understood that their daughter's success was worth celebrating, rather than questioning. I'd like that, I said, meaning it completely. But only if you understand that my business decisions aren't subject to parental approval. You'd be investors with input, not parents with authority. We understand, my mother said with a smile that held none of the condescension of our earlier interactions. We're finally ready to treat you like the successful entrepreneur you've always been, rather than the disappointing daughter we mistakenly thought you were. As we left the restaurant that evening, walking past the staff members who had become skilled professionals rather than invisible servants, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had transformed personal pain into professional success and family conflict into mutual respect. The woman who had once stood frozen behind a velvet curtain, listening to her parents casually destroy her reputation, had become someone who controlled her own narrative and created opportunities for others to succeed. The parents who had dismissed their daughter's potential had learned to celebrate achievements they'd never thought to encourage. And the restaurant where it all began continued to thrive, serving as a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, but about building something so successful that their opinions become irrelevant while their respect becomes inevitable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.